Thank you, Vasant, very much for giving me this opportunity to talk to such a wonderful audience. It's a little bit last minute. I only heard yesterday that I could fill this vacant slot, for which I'm very grateful, also for the support, of course, of the MurthyNAYAK Foundation. And since yesterday, I've been kind of thinking about what I could speak about in the context of this symposium and to such an audience. And I've been thinking about my own position as both a student and a teacher over the past decade or so. Before I begin talking about my trajectory, I thought maybe I'll briefly introduce myself. I'm born in Belgium, in Brussels, but from a very young age, my mother, as a single mother, chose to move away from Belgium with me, and we've lived in many different places, especially in Southeast Asia. So I grew up in Indonesia for a few years before going to Australia. I spent quite a bit of time in India as well as a kid. And when I was 12 years old, I moved to live with my father in Singapore, who still lives there, where I studied high school for about 6 to 7 years. And then to pursue higher education, I moved back to Belgium, because as a Belgian, it's pretty much free to go to university in Belgium. And that's where I ended up studying at the Royal Academy of Fine Arts, School of Arts in Ghent. So in Ghent, I did both a bachelor and a master degree. So that's 3 years and 2 years. And then I kind of quite quickly rolled into doing an artistic PhD program, of which I'm now fulfilling my last year. So that's a 6-year program, and I've been studying there, and I've been teaching there as well for the past 5 years. And that's something I wanted to talk about maybe in this context, which for me is interesting from the perspective of photography education, and especially documentary photography. That when I began my PhD 5 years ago, all of a sudden I was kind of thrown into this role of being a teacher as well, without any real preparation. As a PhD student, you have a 30% of full time that you teach to young photography students. I'm running kind of master seminars with master photography students, in which I simply try to discuss with them, or to bring across to them all the steps that I went through as a student myself. So this is for them, I think, a very nice way to learn, because they can easily put themselves in my position as also having studied there, also having been a student. I myself am also still a student, a doctoral student. So that's the way I ended up teaching, specifically documentary photography. And what I'm going to talk to you about today, 20 minutes is very short, so I'm going to try and squeeze in as much as possible, is what I've realized to be one of the most important aspects of documentary photography, and something that I feel that most of my students as well, and I myself as a student, when I began working with documentary photography, struggle with, or seem to have, something that seems to be one of the most difficult issues to tackle. And that's the kind of self-reflexive approach to documentary photography, meaning that what my kind of main principle, or what I've always tried to achieve in my work, is to, when I make a documentary project, is that the first step is to critically question the language with which you do that. So the language of photography, the complexities of using a medium as photography to tell stories, to represent others, and the kind of, I wouldn't say deceptive nature of photography, but the idea that when you photograph or when you represent, that you're always making something more abstract, removing it from reality, it becomes less objective, and trying to embed that within the work itself. And that's kind of the core aspect that I try to teach my students, and that I also try to tackle myself. So there is many different ways in which one can do that, and throughout all the different works that I've made, I've always tried to attempt to do that in a kind of different method. So I'm gonna kind of speed run through this if I can, beginning with the very first documentary project that I made while I was a bachelor student at school, which is titled Lotus. And this was immediately also a collaboration with another photographer who was a classmate of mine at the time called Quinten de Bruin. We worked together on this project. And I've been doing many collaborations ever since, but that's maybe a whole other story. So I'm just going to flip through some images on the screen of Lotus. It's a body of work that's set in Thailand, of which the subject matter are transgenders, also known as ladyboys, which is something quite common in Thai society. It's not really a taboo, and they're kind of present on all levels of society. I chose to go to Thailand to make my first documentary because naturally I was attracted to go back to Southeast Asia as a student, and at the same time I could also exploit this idea of the exoticness of going to a faraway place to make a documentary that tries to critically question itself. Transgenders also being kind of a stereotypical subject matter, which has been covered in many different documentaries in the past. We thought this was a good place to start to make a documentary that tries to think about its own constructions. So as you can see, a lot of these images have a kind of theatrical aesthetic about them. They look a little bit artificial, a little bit staged. Here and there, you can see this is my arm holding a flashlight, which dips into the frame here and there. And the intention of Quinten and I was to make documentary images that looked almost too good to be true, that looked a bit, you would wonder their authenticity or their kind of constructed nature. And we did this by using artificial lighting and a medium format camera and a certain methodology. We wanted to question the role of aesthetics in documentary photography. Why is it important to make beautiful pictures? Why are photographers generally always trying to find the right composition, beautiful light, le moment décisif, and how often is this removed from the subject that one is trying to document or trying to cover? So that's the first kind of step in my process as a documentary maker, is really questioning the role of aesthetics within documentary photography. So Quinten and I made a series of beautiful documentary photographs in which often something spontaneous happens, but at the same time have this very theatrical aesthetic about them. One of the main things we were aiming for is to, within this very controlled photographic environment, which is set up with lighting, which is kind of a platform that is set onto which then something spontaneous can unfold, which happens outside of our control. For instance, a cat walking by and then someone doing a certain gesture. And it's this combination between spontaneity and constructedness or control, the friction between those two elements that for us made the photographs interesting. We chose to work with transgenders because we thought that they themselves, as people or as a subject, also reflected this idea of theatricality. They're very proud of their bodies. They're very happy to be in the limelight. They very much want to be photographed, want to be admired. And that that kind of reflected the way that we see documentary as a medium as well, where you're kind of embellishing something or constructing something, or you have to look through different visual layers in order to see the reality behind it. So the subject matter that I choose to work with always reflects the way that I see photography itself as well. Of course, a very Western, painterly aesthetic, images that remind you of classic Western painting. This was also something done intentionally so that we very clearly had a Westernized gaze in terms of aesthetics, and referenced our Western visual culture in terms of photography in the shadow of classical painting. Now, as a counter element to this, I have to move on quickly because I'm losing time. I basically make self-published photo books. That's my medium of expression. The books are kind of bodies of works in themselves. They're artist publications, and the books are the works. Now, in the book, what we did is you have a series of gatefolds, which are on yellow pages, that fold out, which are woven in between our photographs. And in those gatefolds, you see snapshots made by some of the people that we worked with themselves. So we gave them little disposable cameras which is kind of a collaborative strategy that's been exhausted up till now. I mean, it's something you see quite a lot. But our intention was to bring two completely different forms of aesthetics together. One where the subject photographs themselves and their own environment with the camera, completely free to do or photograph whatever they wanted, and kind of bring that in combination with a very overly aestheticized photographic way of visualizing something. And in these gatefolds, you see the first image that they made to the last one unedited in the same sequence, and obviously a totally different content, but also very different aesthetic that often goes against all the kind of classic rules that we get taught in school of how to make a good photograph. You see lots of kind of fingers in front of the lens, crooked angles, strange compositions, very spontaneous. But the beauty of it is that those images obviously say a lot more about the subject than we could ever do as photographers. They're intimate, they're their own environment, they're photographing themselves and so on. So for me, as a document, those images have a lot more value. And on top of that, they would sometimes photograph us while we were photographing them. So you have also this kind of self-referential element in there. I still wore shorts back in those days. So this is then that photograph that you see that they're photographing here. Okay, I'm gonna move on to the project I did after that, which set in India. So for my master degree at the school in Ghent, I was looking for a subject which was essentially abstract, where you didn't have a particularly recognizable thing you could aim your camera at and photograph. I wanted to photograph essentially the imagination or the fantasy that we project onto reality. I wanted to see where our kind of symbolic fictions become reality, which is a rather abstract subject, but I found that in the influence of cinema on everyday life. As we all know, the films we see, the fiction that we read, very much forms our perception on things, our ideas, how we see the reality around us. And I wanted to make a documentary about how our cinematic fictions kind of materialize. And that brought me to India because the Bollywood cinema industry, I think, is one of the most influential in the world. And I was also cast as an extra on a Bollywood film set where I had to dance in the background, which gave me a direct first-hand experience of also being a Bollywood actor in a sense. So this yeah, I'm not showing you any pictures of that situation, unfortunately. So this body of work is titled The Fourth Wall. The title references to the four walls on a theater in which you have the back wall, left and right wall, and the fourth wall is the imaginary wall that we imagine is there so that the actors don't acknowledge the audience and vice versa. Because Victoria and I, so Victoria, my wife, is sitting there in the back. Ever since this project, we worked on every project together for the past, 7 years or so. Victoria assists in from everything to lighting, practicalities, to logistics, to research on a number of levels. The only thing she doesn't do is photograph. And Victoria and I ended up, I'm going to make this long story short, making a series of images in the streets of Bombay mainly, also a little bit in Chennai, where regular passerbys or regular people in the streets become actors for our photos. And we ended up making these kind of pictures because at first we began documenting film sets and actors and going behind the scenes and so on. But then I realized I was just making another kind of reportage about the cinema industry, and that didn't interest me. But soon we realized that when we set our camera up in the streets, just trying to find a good example here, sorry. When we set our camera up in the streets, and started installing lighting, because I would select a certain location because it had a kind of cinematic feel to it. It looked a bit like it could be a film decor or something like that, rather anonymous, kind of nondescript spaces. People would instantly start to gather around us. Before we knew it, we had like 30 people standing around us trying to see what we were doing. And then by itself, in a very spontaneous way, people would present themselves to be photographed. 5 minutes. This is quite an exercise. Yeah, people would kind of start to perform their cinema fantasies for us, because the situation was there, the camera was there, the lighting was there, and then someone else from the crowd would start directing. No, you stand there, you stand, and this kind of whole performance unfolded itself in front of us. So when we were making the book, we decided to remove all the images of professional actors and only include pictures that were made in that kind of mode. And these images were then also interwoven with stories that we sourced from newspapers, in which there's a kind of confusion between fiction and reality. But I'm not going to go into that now, because that's maybe too much. So I'm in 5 minutes going to try to talk about the next project, because this also takes place in India, which is a little bit of a follow-up of The Fourth Wall, in a sense that instead of focusing on the influence of Bollywood film, we chose to focus on the main theme of the Bollywood film, which is the love story mainly. And through our research, Victoria and I encountered this group called the Love Commandos. You see them here, the four gentlemen, not the one in the middle, which most of you probably know. The Love Commandos is an organization that gives shelter to young couples that are running away out of fear of being killed by their parents, which is called honor killings. Something I probably don't need to explain to you here, but basically it's this conflict between arranged marriage and love marriage. Many people who can't be together because they're from different castes or different religions end up eloping, kind of classic Romeo and Juliet situation. And a lot of the times they get killed out of honor from the family if they do choose to be together. But organizations like the Love Commandos give them the opportunity of safety and to be married officially. They send the certificates over to their families. They help them set up a new life and so on. So that's that organization. And the documentary that we made kind of tries to put two things together. On the one hand, these couples that are running away, which you recognize because they're all in this same blue space and presented in a sequence in the book. So these are actual couples on the run. And outside of that, images that kind of relate more to stories either told by those couples to us of how they ran away, but then you could say reenactments or images that stand in for their stories without those people specifically in the picture having any relevance to their narrative. They're just kind of, again, the imagination that takes form in an image. Along with different smaller stories of, for example, a man that built a replica of a Taj Mahal for his wife in concrete instead of marble. Or a very rich man that came to India looking for a new wife, placing a full-page ad in the matrimonial section, here with his newlywed wife next to him. But then also to metaphorical images, which is for me where, again, it becomes interesting as a documentary maker when you completely remove the act of photographing something to completely constructing or staging things that often take forms in still lives for me. For example, the toppling glass of milk, which is a reference to a trope from Bollywood films from back in the day where they couldn't really show any explicit erotic content. They would have this image of flowing milk, which would suggest, let's use our imagination to... two flowers touch, or little bees, or more serious issues like bridal burning. I don't like to photograph victims or suffering or people who are in dire situations, so I then choose to represent it in that kind of form. Something also important for me to mention in this context is that as essentially a European or someone from a Western kind of society or upbringing, it was also an interesting exercise to see how our notions, or Victoria and I, arriving into these secret shelters with our obvious thoughts of love marriage being the kind of correct or natural sense of being together, in stark contrast with these couples that are running away for their lives. But the more that we spoke to people and the more that we read about it and the more that we learned about it, the more apparent it became to us that it's an extremely complex situation, and also one that we cannot take a position in terms of saying this is good or this is bad. What we simply did was document these couples in these shelters, but then also document, for example, the most common honeymoon location at the foothills of the Himalayas in Manali. So these are all in every car. There is a couple going up to the top to be photographed together on their honeymoon. So essentially, it's a love story, which goes into the love story as a kind of fantasy or a projection of desire, but also has a very strong documentary core of these young couples being in situations where they have to run away, which come back into decent. So maybe the last, because I think my time is up, I'm going to end with this image because something interesting happened here, if you would allow me another 2 minutes. This is a couple we photographed in one of the secret shelters, and they told us, well, not specifically them, but another couple, I believe it might be them, told us about how they met. They told us their personal love story, and how they met was that they lived next to each other in neighboring houses, and every evening they would sneak up to the rooftops and throw love letters to each other, and they would communicate in that sense without their family knowing about it. So we would note down these stories, we would interview these people, and then later these would form scenes or images that we would recreate with friends of ours or people that we knew or people that we would meet. And this is then the kind of resulting image of which represents that story of how those two met. But only much later, when we came back to Belgium, we realized out of some weird coincidence that the clothes that the people here in this picture are wearing, which is made in Mumbai, are exactly the same clothes as the couple is wearing here, which is in a shelter in Delhi. So these kind of things happen, and there is a kind of meaning within photography that might go beyond how we try to rationalize or theorize or try to grasp or understand reality. And I think it's those magical moments that, for me, in a sense, make it worthwhile. Thank you. That was...